Do you ever wonder why the avoidant doesn't seem to feel the weight of your absence right away? Why they can just walk away seemingly unbothered while you're drowning in confusion and emotion? Let me break something down for you. And it's going to change the way you see this dynamic forever. The avoidant doesn't realize your value while you're still there. And they don't see it when you're available, when you're explaining yourself, when you're trying to reconnect or make sense of what went wrong. No, their realization doesn't happen in your presence. It happens in your absence. It happens in isolation. It happens when the noise stops. That's when the mirror turns on. See, the avoidant attachment style is rooted in emotional survival. These people are masters at disconnecting when closeness starts to feel threatening. It's not because you were doing something wrong. It's because intimacy pokes at wounds they don't know how to face. Their instinct is to pull away, shut down, run, and in the moment, they actually believe that distance will protect them, that silence is their safety. But here's the truth most people never tell you, that silence starts off feeling like peace to an avoidant, but over time, it transforms into a prison. In the beginning, they feel relief. You're not texting, you're not calling, you're not confronting. It feels like they've regained control. But what they don't realize is that you've just created the perfect environment for awareness to creep in, not on your timeline, but on theirs. And here's the kicker. Avoidants don't wake up from logic. They wake up from loss. When you were chasing them, when you were emotionally available, they couldn't see your worth because their walls were up. Your presence was filtered through their fear. But when you're gone, truly gone, they're forced to sit with something they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Their own mind. That quiet space becomes the breeding ground for truth, for regret, for self-confrontation. The very detachment they use to escape you becomes the same detachment that exposes their own emotional emptiness. You think they're fine just because they're not reaching out. Think again. Avoidants don't process pain outwardly, they internalize it. They compartmentalize it, but it leaks into their work, into their sleep, into their mental clarity, and suddenly the one thing they thought they needed, space, becomes the weight they can't carry. This is why your silence is more powerful than any text you could send. Because it isn't just silence, it's evidence. It proves to them that the emotional safety they pushed away was real. That the one person who actually showed up is no longer waiting at the door. And that realization doesn't hit like a lightning bolt. It seeps in slowly, and then all at once. And make no mistake, it's not your words that change them. It's your absence. It's the quiet. It's the space that forces their subconscious to speak louder than your voice ever could. You become the thought they can't unthink, the feeling they can't bury, the connection they can't replace. They realize they need you when you're no longer accessible because until you disappear, they never had to miss you. They never had to confront the reality of losing you. And for someone who runs from closeness, losing someone who felt safe is the ultimate awakening. So if you're stuck wondering why they haven't realized your worth yet, maybe the answer is simple. You're still too close for them to feel the distance. Let them sit in the silence. Let them wrestle with it. Because in that stillness, truth has no place to hide. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. Let's talk about ego, because the avoidance ego is the armor they wear to survive emotional vulnerability. And that ego, it's not just about arrogance or pride. It's deeper than that. It's how they maintain control in relationships without ever having to expose the raw, unhealed parts of themselves. But what happens when you stop feeding it? Avoidants are addicted to emotional distance, not because they don't care, but because closeness threatens their inner stability. When someone gets too close, when they feel emotionally seen, they begin to panic, not outwardly, but internally. So they create emotional barriers. They pull back, they withdraw affection, attention, and eventually communication. But they do it in a way that still keeps them in control. They want the power dynamic tilted in their favor. And as long as you're trying, texting, explaining, apologizing, waiting, they feel safe in that position. Not emotionally safe, egoically safe. They know you'll reach out. They know you'll check in. They know you'll be there. even after the coldness, even after the disappearing act. And that knowing becomes fuel for their ego. It reinforces the belief that they don't need to change, they don't need to apologize, and they don't need to face the discomfort of growth. Because you're still orbiting them. You're still emotionally invested, still available. But what they don't expect, what shocks the system, is when you stop feeding that pattern. When you go silent, not to manipulate, but because you finally awakened. You stop giving them the reassurance they never gave you. You stop trying to decode their behavior. You stop showing up for someone who never truly met you in the middle. And in that moment, their ego takes a hit it never saw coming. You got to understand, this kind of silence isn't just the absence of words. It's the collapse of their illusion of control. And that's terrifying to an avoidant. Why? Because it forces them to sit with the one thing they've been avoiding their entire life. The fear that they are not emotionally self-sufficient, no matter how hard they pretend to be. When the ego no longer gets fed by your attention, it panics. Because that attention wasn't just a compliment to their confidence. It was the core of their stability. You were the emotional anchor they pretended not to need. You were the safe place they silently relied on. And when that disappears, they don't just feel confused, they feel exposed. Now, here's where it gets even deeper. When you stop chasing, you force the avoidant to confront an unfamiliar truth, that your presence was never the problem, their inability to receive it was. And that realization, if it hits, is painful. Because now they have to question not just your worth, but their behavior, their belief system, their entire relational identity. That's the moment transformation begins. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but the seed is planted. The story in their mind begins to crack. They start questioning why the person they thought would always be there suddenly isn't. And they begin to understand that what they perceived as power was actually avoidance. And what they perceived as weakness in you, your vulnerability, your love, your consistency, was the very strength they are afraid to possess. That's why silence isn't passive, it's active. It's not punishment, it's reflection. And when done from a place of self-respect, not bitterness, you stop feeding the ego and start feeding the truth. You send a message that can't be ignored. You will not beg to be valued. So if you've pulled back and they still haven't moved, don't flinch. Don't go back. You're not starving them of love. You're starving their ego of the fuel it never deserved. When you stop feeding the ego, the soul finally has a chance to speak. Let's go deeper into what really happens when you step away, when you go silent and the avoidant is left alone with their thoughts. Most people think that's when the avoidant forgets you. That's when they finally feel free. But here's what no one tells you. That's when the fantasy starts to fall apart. See, avoidants build narratives in their minds to justify emotional distance. They convince themselves you're too demanding, too emotional, too needy. Why? Because if they painted you as safe, as supportive, as deeply loving, they'd have no excuse to run. So instead, they distort reality. They twist who you are to protect their emotional boundaries. It's not conscious. It's not malicious. It's psychological survival. But here's where it gets interesting. The fantasy they created about you, it only works when you're around to argue with it. When you're still in their life, they can hold on to their version of the story because your presence triggers their defenses. They see your love as pressure, your communication as confrontation, your care as control. But the moment you pull back, the narrative loses its foundation. Now they're alone. And in that solitude, without your energy to react to, something unexpected happens. The illusion starts to break. The story they told themselves about you being too much starts to feel thin, hollow, unconvincing. And slowly, the truth begins to rise from underneath the distortion. They remember how patient you were, how you listened even when they shut down, how you held space for their moods, their inconsistencies, their withdrawals. And suddenly, they're not looking at the version of you they built out of fear. They're starting to see the real you, the one who didn't walk away when things got hard, the one who asked for clarity, not control, the one who loved them, not for who they pretended to be, but for who they really are. And that realization, it's earth-shattering. Because now, the avoidant is no longer running from you, they're running from themselves. from the shame of pushing away something genuine, from the guilt of misjudging someone who only ever wanted connection, and most of all, from the haunting question, what if I ruined something that was actually safe? This is why silence is so powerful, not because it hurts them, but because it breaks the story they were hiding behind. And here's what you need to understand. Fantasy dies in solitude. When there's no one to blame, no one to project onto, no one to control the narrative with, they start confronting the truth. And the truth is this: you were never too much. You were too real. But by the time they reach that understanding, you're no longer where they left you. You've grown. You've healed. You've stopped asking for closure and started giving it to yourself. And now, they're not just missing you, they're grieving the version of you that would have still chosen them. So if you're in the silence right now, and you're wondering whether they're realizing what they lost, trust this: the fantasy is fading. And when it finally shatters, what's left isn't your fault, it's their lesson. When the illusion breaks, the truth speaks. And the truth is, they never lost you, they pushed you away. Here's something that'll challenge everything you thought you knew about emotional dynamics with an avoidant. They don't start missing you while you're there. They start missing you the moment you stop being predictable. When you pull your energy back, when you become unavailable, not out of manipulation, but because your soul got tired of being accessed like a convenience store. That's when the psychological shift happens. That's when they start thinking about you in a way they never have before. You see, avoidants are wired to subconsciously devalue what feels too accessible. It's not that they don't care, it's that their nervous system equates consistency with threat. Closeness reminds them of past experiences where vulnerability led to pain, abandonment, or emotional suffocation. So even if you're loving, kind, and grounded, your emotional presence can activate a fear response. And that fear turns into withdrawal, detachment, and emotional shutdown. Not because of you, but because of what you trigger. Here's the paradox. The more available you are, the less they register your presence. It blends into the background. You become part of the emotional scenery, safe, constant, and overlooked. But the moment you pull back, when the texts stop, the calls fade, your energy retracts. Something hits them that they can't explain. Suddenly the quiet feels loud, the stillness feels unfamiliar. And that unfamiliarity begins to stir something deeper than awareness. It stirs longing. You were always there, so they never had to reach. They never had to question, never had to wonder. That lack of uncertainty created a false sense of security, not in the relationship, but in their control of it. You showing up consistently meant they didn't have to. But the moment that dynamic changes, their brain gets confused. Wait, where did she go? Why isn't she reacted? Is she done? Is she over it? And that's the exact moment you shift from being a comfort they took for granted to a mystery they can't stop thinking about. Because here's what's really going on underneath the surface. When you become less available, you unconsciously trigger the very fear they projected onto you. Now they're the ones sitting with uncertainty. They're the ones wondering if they're losing something meaningful. And that anxiety is something they're not used to processing because they've always had the upper hand. But emotional power dynamics are fluid. And when you stop showing up for the version of them that won't grow, you cause their emotional system to reboot. Don't underestimate what that does to a person who thought they'd always have access to you. It breaks the illusion that you're waiting. It disrupts the belief that you'll always be there, no matter how they treat you. And it forces them to confront something raw and real. Your presence was never promised. It was a privilege. And now it's gone. You're not trying to punish them. You're not playing games. You're simply reclaiming your emotional energy. And in doing so, you shift from being predictable to profound, from being available to being valuable, from being seen as a constant to being felt as a loss. And this is why they start thinking about you more the moment you become silent. Not because they suddenly changed, but because you did. You broke the cycle. You interrupted the pattern. You created the contrast their mind couldn't ignore. So don't mistake their silence for indifference. That distance they put between you and them, it becomes the very thing that haunts them. Because it's not your presence that haunts the avoidant. It's the moment they realize it's no longer theirs. You were never too much. They were just never ready for someone who wouldn't beg to be remembered. Now let's talk about something most people miss entirely when dealing with an avoidant. The slow, creeping realization that they didn't just lose a person, they lost an anchor. You see, avoidants are terrified of emotional dependence. Not because they don't want connection, but because connection represents vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens their illusion of self-sufficiency. So they keep people at a distance, convinced that they're better off alone. But here's the truth they never see coming. They were never as independent as they believed. You were their emotional stabilizer, and they only realize it once you're gone. Let's break this down. Avoidants crave space, but they also crave control within that space. They want connection, but on their terms, on their timeline, in doses they can manage. And while they pull away from overt closeness, they quietly rely on your emotional availability to stay grounded. Your presence, your willingness to understand, to show up, to hold steady, becomes their emotional safety net. Even if they never acknowledge it. They might not express it, but they orbit around it. Subconsciously, they structure their emotional world around the predictability of you. That's what makes your silence so disorienting. When you step out of the equation, when you detach not out of anger but out of clarity, their emotional environment collapses. And the chaos they feel, it's not just missing you. It's the destabilization of the emotional infrastructure they've depended on without ever giving credit to. They don't just miss your texts. They miss the certainty behind them. They don't just miss your voice. They miss the safety it gave them. And when that anchor disappears, they're left in emotional freefall. This is where the inner turmoil begins. Not on day 1, not even on day 10, but somewhere in the stillness of your absence, they begin to unravel. Slowly, silently, it starts with irritation. Why haven't you reached out? Then confusion. Did you really mean that much to them? Then discomfort. Why does everything feel so off balance without you? Because the truth is your love wasn't noise, it was structure. It was the thing holding up what they convinced themselves they built alone. Now here's where the philosophical depth kicks in. The human psyche is wired for connection, even in those who fear it. Neuroscience backs this. Our brains are built to bond, and even those who push love away are shaped by its presence. So when love leaves, especially love that's been patient, consistent, and strong, it doesn't just vanish. It echoes, it lingers, it creates a vacuum. And that vacuum becomes unbearable for someone who thought they didn't need anyone. That's why avoidants often come back, not just to you, but to the version of themselves that felt secure with you. Not because they've suddenly healed, but because without you, they're forced to face what they've been avoiding all along, that the thing they pushed away was the very thing keeping them steady. Now let me be clear. This doesn't mean you go running back. This doesn't mean you put your life on pause, waiting for them to realize your worth. It means you recognize the power of your absence, the transformational weight of your silence. You didn't walk away to be chased. You walked away to protect your peace. And in doing so, you became the mirror they couldn't avoid. So if they return, it's not because they suddenly changed overnight. It's because in the silence, they met a part of themselves they never knew existed, the part that needed you. And that's not weakness, that's awakening. The moment they feel your absence is chaos is the moment they realize your presence was their calm. There comes a point, usually long after the silence has settled, when the avoidant begins to realize something they've never wanted to confront. They didn't just miss you, they sabotaged the very connection that could have healed them. And this is where things get brutally real. Avoidants by nature are wired to self-protect. Their nervous system interprets closeness as danger. Vulnerability as exposure. So they run, they shut down, they create distance. But they don't realize in the process of running from pain, they're running from growth, from intimacy, from love that demands their participation. Because love, real love, isn't passive. It's not built on convenience. It's built on accountability. And that terrifies someone who's been emotionally hiding their whole life. Now here's the twist they never expected. Your silence didn't just disrupt the dynamic, it exposed their sabotage. And when that realization hits, it doesn't just hurt, it shatters them. Because now they're face to face with the truth. Not the fantasy, not the projection, but the undeniable fact that you were the one offering something real. You weren't the threat, you were the mirror. You reflected back their potential. You invited them into depth. You gave them a chance to evolve into someone who could receive love, not just avoid it, and they rejected it, not because of you, but because the old self wasn't ready to die. That's the brutal psychology of emotional avoidance. It's not that they didn't want you, it's that they weren't ready to become who they needed to be to keep you. And when they realize that, that's when the shame kicks in. Because they didn't lose you randomly, they lost you intentionally through silence, through resistance, through fear disguised as independence. And now they sit in the echo chamber of the decision they made. One you didn't force, but one they orchestrated through their own inability to rise. And it's in that moment of raw, piercing awareness that something cracks. That wall they built around their emotions, it starts to collapse under the weight of accountability. The realization that it wasn't just fate or bad timing or emotional incompatibility, it was self-sabotage. They had love in their hands and they crushed it with their own resistance. Now let's pause here, because this is critical. When someone realizes they destroyed the very thing they prayed for, when they wake up to the pain they caused not just to you, but to themselves, they enter what psychologists call a rupture, a psychological fracture between who they've been and who they could have been had they chosen courage over comfort. And that fracture, it doesn't heal easily because it carries the weight of missed opportunities, of burned bridges, of unspoken apologies. But here's the part I want you to hold on to. That rupture isn't your responsibility to fix. That guilt, that grief, that's not your burden to carry. You didn't walk away out of cruelty. You walked away out of self-respect. You didn't cause the pain, they caused it by refusing to grow. Now your absence isn't just something they feel, it's something they learn from. Because your silence taught them what your words never could, that love cannot survive in the shadows of fear. So if they return, it won't be for comfort, it'll be because the old version of them can't live with what they destroyed. Whether or not you let them back in is your choice. But understand this, your evolution didn't happen in spite of their absence. It happened because of it. Sometimes the only way someone wakes up is when they realize they were the villain in a story that was trying to save them.